So, if today's subject matter sounds like something you've heard before on Most Notorious, it is. Kind of. I did an episode way back in 2017, episode 61, with James Badal about the Cleveland torso murders. This episode is also about those murders, but equally about Eliot Ness, a continuation of his story from the previous episode. And I am very grateful to A. Brad Schwartz for continuing this fascinating conversation. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Most Notorious podcast. I'm Eric Rivenes, another mammoth interview, so let's get right into it. I am so pleased to have as my guest once again, A. Brad Schwartz, back to talk about Eliot Ness post Al Capone. Again, he is a co-author, along with Max Allan Collins, of two books which cover the incredible life and times of Eliot Ness. Scarface and the Untouchable, Al Capone, Eliot Ness, and the Battle of Chicago, which of course was a very recent episode of the show. And it's a sequel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Eliot Ness and the Mad Butcher, hunting America's deadliest unidentified serial killer at the dawn of modern criminology. Thanks so much for returning to continue Eliot Ness's story here on the podcast.
It's great to be back. Feels like I never left. So thank you for having me.
Yeah. I hope you enjoyed the guest room.
Yeah, exactly. Just like home.
So was this something you planned all along, writing a second book about Eliot Ness?
Yes and no to your question, in the sense that the plan from the very beginning, sort of as we talked about last time, my co-author Max Allan Collins and I set out on this project 10 years, or so ago. We started talking about it seriously, and we started out with the idea that we wanted to correct the historical record on Eliot Ness and the way his work and his life had been characterized in a lot of the nonfiction writing on the subject that had been done. And so the idea of telling the second act of his life, the Cleveland story, was always a major part of that, because Max and I both felt that that's really, even more than the Chicago period, the remarkable period of Ness's life. Max had written several novels back in the 80s and 90s dealing with this period and the events in it, and I had discovered those books when I was a kid, and that's part of what stoked my interest in the topic. So we always knew that we wanted to tackle everything that's in this second book, but we sort of set out, similarly to how you and I started out with a conversation that was supposed to be about Eliot Ness in Chicago, and now we're on to a second episode. We started out with the notion of doing one book. Initially, we thought we might just do Ness. Later on, we liked the idea of bringing in Capone, and as the research in the into the Chicago chapter convinced us there was more to say on that side of the story, that the dual biography element of Scarface and the Untouchable developed, and the Cleveland story just doesn't fit as comfortably into that structure. And so at a certain point, again, as you are well aware, having read the books, the first part of this, the Chicago part, just sort of grew and grew. We knew by that point we had a publisher and an editor, and we knew that they were comfortable with a book of a certain length, but not of a book that would be twice as long as what it was developing into. And so we decided, having done almost all of the research and quite a bit of the work into the second part, that we would set that aside and we would focus on telling the Chicago story. And we already had indications from our editor that he was interested in the Cleveland part, interested in the Butcher story specifically. And so, it was a gamble, but it seemed like a pretty safe bet to say we're going to focus on the Chicago story. We're going to tell that well, and then perhaps we'll be lucky enough to have the publisher come on board for part two. And that's exactly what happened.
Wow, that's great. Glad it happened that way.
Me too.
So to catch listeners up, we left off with Eliot Ness struggling for a couple of years in Chicago after Capone's conviction in the waning months of Prohibition. Why did Ness eventually leave Chicago?
Well, he didn't leave initially by choice, I think. He had, as you said, he was sort of stuck in a career dead end at this point where Prohibition was coming to an end. Obviously, FDR is inaugurated in 1933. Beer is legalized very soon after that, and Prohibition itself is ultimately repealed by the 21st Amendment in December of 1933. So Ness, at that point, he's been very successful as a member of the Prohibition Bureau and has achieved a certain amount of national fame, although it was fleeting at that moment. But as Prohibition is on its way out, the agency that Ness is working for sort of becomes superfluous. And so he's funneled into a new alcohol tax unit of the Treasury Department because, as alcohol is legalized, the government wants to make taxes on it. So there's still a semblance of a bootleg trade. There's still people trying to evade tax by selling and making alcohol illegally, but it's nowhere near as central to American life as Prohibition had been at that point. Even though it's a moneymaker for organized crime, the major gangs have moved on, so the liquor laws are a less effective weapon to go after organized crime, which is what Ness's primary goal always was. He was never committed to the cause of Prohibition. He simply saw it as the best way to go after these organizations that were corrupting government and politics and commerce in America's major cities. And there's no really room for advancement at that point for somebody in the alcohol tax unit. So in 32, 33, as Ness is coming off the success of the Capone case, as he's seeing the writing on the wall as far as Prohibition is concerned, as that was becoming increasingly clear that it was on its way out, he decides to try and seek a new career in the burgeoning Bureau of Investigation. It wasn't yet called the FBI, but the organization run by J. Edgar Hoover. This is right before, sort of, if you've read the book Public Enemies, right before the period in 33 and 34 where the FBI becomes legendary, going after John Dillinger and Pretty Boy Floyd and Babyface Nelson, and sort of makes itself into an American icon. This is right before that. And Ness, based on his success going after the Capone organization, thinks he would be a good candidate to run the Chicago office of the FBI, Bureau of Investigation, which at that point was headed by Melvin Purvis, who was not yet famous. Again, Dillinger is in his future. Purvis did not have a particularly good track record at that point. He hadn't demonstrated his abilities that would lead him to being the man responsible for stopping John Dillinger, and Ness thought he could do a better job. So he starts, in his fumbling way, I think, following the example of his brother-in-law, Alexander Jamie, who we talked about last time. But Ness starts kind of trying to seek some political favors with some of the political leadership in Chicago at that time, tries to ingratiate himself with the Bureau. But when Purvis gets the sense that Ness is gunning for his job, essentially, he starts feeding information to Hoover that is derogatory about Ness, that suggests that this is not someone who the FBI would want on their team. As we also talked about last time, Hoover is someone who's very interested in public opinion, very interested in managing popular culture as a way of shoring up his own power, would later turn on Purvis once Purvis's fame threatened to eclipse his own. And so the idea of somebody who had become as noteworthy as Ness was joining the Bureau, which is supposed to be this legion of anonymous agents working under J. Edgar Hoover as the personification of the FBI. Ness having his own public track record is already not a good fit for the Bureau that Hoover was developing. So thanks to that, thanks to Purvis's influence in pretty effectively torpedoing Ness's application, Ness becomes persona non grata with the FBI, and so he can't progress that way. He can't progress through the channels of the alcohol tax unit. Some of the evidence that came out as a result of the background checks that the FBI was doing into him, there were some indications that he may have acceded to political influence in not busting one or two stills as quickly as he should have. In any event, that sort of, rather than kicking him out of the Bureau, that leads to him being transferred out of the city of Chicago and sort of being stuck in an office initially based in Cincinnati. But after the repeal of Prohibition, that he becomes mainly concerned with busting hillbilly stills and moonshine operations in sort of the mountains of Kentucky and southern Ohio and Tennessee. It's nowhere near the glamorous work he'd been doing up to that time, the stuff that he had been really well suited to do. I mean, he had demonstrated an aptitude and an affinity for going after large urban criminal organizations and building these sort of complex cases that were a new development in federal law enforcement at that time. Now he's risking his life, getting shot at by, as he would describe them, mountain men who, unlike the gangsters of Chicago, had very little compulsion against firing on federal officers. So it's certainly one of the more dangerous parts of his career, it seems like, and one of the less satisfying. And something that he, as far as we can tell, I mean, he's not somebody who certainly left a written record of his feelings and emotions. I don't think it's something he was very interested in sharing generally, his inner thoughts. But he was clearly unhappy. He was clearly interested in a different career path. And then in 1934, he's transferred, still with the alcohol tax unit, to the office based in the city of Cleveland, Ohio, where he's now back going against gangsters and large illicit enterprises that are engaged in bootlegging and raiding nightclubs and breweries and stills and getting the kinds of headlines he got in Chicago. So he finds his groove again for about a year in what would be his final year with the alcohol tax unit.
Right. So he's working for the alcohol tax unit, and he suddenly finds himself in the running for a position with the city of Cleveland as the director of public safety. How does that happen? Was it a job that he wanted, that he was excited about?
Well, Cleveland at that time was widely regarded as perhaps the most dangerous city in America on various measures. Certainly one of the most corrupt, and corrupt in a different way from Chicago, where Chicago was controlled by a political machine and sort of an alliance between crime and various political figures who effectively controlled the workings of the city. Cleveland was regarded as an open city by the underworld, a place where the bandits and the bank robbers who the FBI was in the process of chasing could often find safe haven. There's a lot of street crime, a lot of violent crime, organized crime, political corruption, particularly after the stock market crash and the Great Depression set in. Cleveland, being a city that depended on heavy industry, suffered terribly during the economic contraction. So you had a lot of unemployment. You had a lot of corruption within the municipal agencies, police and fire. So the city was a mess in the early years of the Depression. So much so that in 1934, a new mayoral administration was voted into office, led by 1935. The new mayoral administration was voted into office, led by the new mayor, Harold Burton, who had been a Republican, but who ran as an independent, promising to clean up the city, promising to be independent of the political organizations, and specifically promising a reform of the Department of Public Safety, the city of Cleveland, that controlled the police and the fire departments. Again, police corruption in Cleveland was endemic, aided and abetted by prohibition. A lot of the protection payments and things that had developed in order to facilitate the illicit alcohol industry were held over after the repeal of prohibition, and a major, organized crime operation that came to be known as the Cleveland Syndicate, led by people like Mo Dalitz and others who would go on to create modern Las Vegas, had developed in Cleveland as a result of prohibition and was still running a lot of the bootlegging operations that Ness was busting as an ATU agent. So they had effectively corrupted the police department, which was also at that time not just a nest of corruption, but incompetence and racism and brutality and every problem you could have with an urban police department. The Cleveland Police Department had. And that doesn't even get us into a fire department that also was, poorly trained and lacking in equipment and poor morale and every other issue. And so it was a big job, certainly even bigger than going after Al Capone. If you're talking about seriously cleaning up the municipal government of Cleveland in general and the Cleveland Safety Department specifically. So Ness was not Burton's first choice to be the director of public safety, and he was sort of an outside candidate. But Burton, when he met with Ness for the first time in December of 1935, Ness by that point is 32. Burton found him very impressive. I think the Ness's reputation at that point as a federal law enforcement officer, which I said had revived when he got to Cleveland, when he started getting back into the work that he had done previously and got press attention for the work he was doing, busting stills and breweries and things run by this Cleveland syndicate. That was something that would have appealed to Burton, because Burton knew, as a reformer coming in to clean up a very corrupt town, he needed the news media on his side. He needed to demonstrate through press coverage that he was on the job, that he was getting things done, that his administration was living up to the promises that he'd made during the campaign. And Ness, as someone with a track record of being able not just to do the work, but to get attention, the right kind of attention for doing that work, I think made him a more attractive candidate than he would have otherwise have been. Ness, of course, as we kind of discussed last time, while he was in Chicago, in between a couple of the major cases he handled as a prohibition agent, he had taken a postgraduate course at the University of Chicago in police administration with a man by the name of August Vollmer, who had been the chief of police in Berkeley, California, who was the leader of a movement in the early 20th century to professionalize and reform and modernize law enforcement. So by taking this course in police administration, Ness was seeking the kind of professional credentials and training that would allow him to treat law enforcement as a profession and not a job, the same sort of training that a doctor or a lawyer might seek at that time. Ness was trying to do the analogous thing in his field. But in learning police administration, he was unwittingly preparing himself for exactly the sort of job he would be offered in 1935 by the new mayor of Cleveland. So he had the background in that sense, he had the training, and he had the ideas, many of which he had gotten from Vollmer, about not just how to clean up a very corrupt and ineffective police operation, but how to modernize it, how to transform it into something very different from what it was at that time, to focus less on crime suppression, which was understood as the main job of police at that time, and focus more toward what Ness would have called crime prevention. So, having reached the end of his path with the feds, he realized, I think, that this was an unexpected but a certainly welcome opportunity to finally put some of his ideas into practice and to prove himself as a new kind of law enforcement official. And that's what he set out to do.
And there was a lot of excitement in the city, high hopes that Ness would come in and clean things up. But there was also some concern that he wasn't affiliated with any specific political party. In fact, he claimed he was apolitical and didn't vote through the 1920s, right?
Yeah, I would take him at his word that he was apolitical, at least at that point in time. That's sort of it's difficult for people, I think, in our current environment to conceive of, but there was a sense at that time that if you were a civil servant, or even if you were a member of the news media, you might abstain from voting or participating in the political process because you were supposed to be a neutral or an outside observer, not someone who was directly engaged in politicking. So I take him at his word there. Yes, there was great excitement, certainly among the news media, who had gotten to know Ness as an ATU agent and who recognized that he would be good copy. And many of them, the Cleveland press figures, were responsible in the first several years of his tenure for building him up, for creating this mythic reputation that he developed and came to enjoy in Cleveland that was central to his effectiveness as a police executive. So he came to depend on that press coverage. And, it was by this point, by 1935, Hoover and the FBI had fully burst onto the American scene again in the Public Enemies era. So Dillinger by this point is dead. Alvin Karpis has been captured. Like, the Public Enemies era is over, or not. Karpis hadn't been captured quite yet, but that was coming. But in any event, so Ness, even though he's independent of the FBI, is portrayed and seen as that type of G-man. So that's something that, again, is to his benefit with the public, because it's the Depression. It's a very dark time. There's a lot that's going on that's frightening, both in the United States and around the world. So for the citizenry of Cleveland, they're in need of heroes, and Ness is a very attractive one for them at that point in time. At the same time, as you alluded to, for certain interest groups in the city of Cleveland, particularly in the police department, which had its own ways of doing things, its own centers of power, police officials who had secured their positions through graft and various forms of legal activity, even for the chief of police, a fellow by the name of George Madowitz, who was not himself corrupt, but who had learned that the way you rise in such an organization is by offending as few people as possible. There was some awareness that this guy could upset the apple cart in a serious way. But I don't think, at least initially, people took, those people who might have seen him as a threat, took him very seriously, because he was an outsider, because he was a college boy, someone who you might be forgiven for thinking was all talk and no action. So there was some whistling past the graveyard in late 35 and into early 36 by people who might have thought, yeah, he talks a big game, but he doesn't know how we run things. And, we'll be able to put him in his place. And they discovered rather quickly that they were mistaken.
Speaking of Alvin Karpis, you wrote about a particular incident where Eliot Ness came close to catching him, right?
Inadvertently, yeah. And it's the moment when, that's when I said Karpis is still at large. I remembered this. That's the moment when he proves himself to not just the city and the people who were searching for a hero, but to many of his doubters. And it's this great story where Ness was sitting in a city council meeting. And for someone who was as much of an adrenaline junkie as he was, someone who had no tolerance whatsoever for bureaucratic procedure or any level of boredom, this must have just been torturous. And he gets a phone call from the county prosecutor, who is a Democrat, who was the opposite political party, theoretically, as the administration that Ness was a part of, a guy by the name of Frank Dolezal. But the prosecutor informs Ness that he had led a raiding party to this gambling club that was within Cuyahoga County the county, the Ohio County of which Cleveland is the center, but outside the city line. So Ness, as a city employee, has no jurisdiction outside the city line of Cleveland. Culleton, as the county prosecutor, does. And so he went to raid this gambling club, one of these major income generating operations for the Cleveland syndicate that were situated just outside the city line so that they couldn't be troubled by the police. But Culleton goes to raid it and several other clubs. And when his men approach the front door, they're stopped by the bouncers who threaten them with machine guns and say that if anybody crosses this threshold, they're going to get mowed down. And so Culleton has a warrant for the inside of the club. He doesn't have a warrant to search any vehicles or anything like that. So he and his men, while they're trying to, just a handful of private detectives, special deputies, while they're trying to figure out what to do, and everybody's stuck inside the club, they're watching them sort of cart all these gambling paraphernalia out and putting it in trucks, and taking it away, and the prosecutors can't do anything about it. So Culleton is desperately calling. First, he calls the county sheriff. He's calling everybody he can think of, try to get to help. Nobody wants to help him. Nobody wants to cross the mob or to put themselves in this dangerous situation. And finally, out of desperation, he calls Ness. And he says, I understand that this is not your territory. This is outside your jurisdiction. There's nothing you can do officially, but is there anything you can do to help? And Ness says, just wait right there. I'm on my way. And it happens to be right around the time that there's a shift change in the police department. So Ness goes to the police station. He goes to the locker room or the ready room, where all these cops are coming off their shifts and getting ready to go home. And Ness explains the situation. And he says, I know that we have no legal authority. This is outside our jurisdiction, but I'm planning to go as a private citizen to demonstrate that there's some respect for law in this town, some willingness to stand up to the gangsters. And anybody who wants to join me, I would welcome your support. But if you're hurt or killed, it's not in the line of duty, so that you wouldn't get a special pension or anything like that. Your families wouldn't be provided for. But essentially offering these police officers the chance to show that they're still the good guys, that they're not part of the corruption that has become such a problem in the city of Cleveland. And so everybody in the room decides to go with him. So the prosecutor Culleton expects Ness and maybe a handful of people to show up. Instead, he gets this platoon of squad cars and uniformed men armed with tear gas guns and everything else. And Ness comes in and confers with Culleton. And then they sort of cross the parking lot. Ness is at the lead of this phalanx of men that crosses the parking lot, brightly illuminated at this point, even though it's the middle of the night. And Ness, what happens exactly at the door is somewhat unclear, but it appears that Ness is the one who forces the door open and then allows Culleton to, once it's clear that they're not going to be shot, allows Culleton to go in, because Culleton is the official with the warrant. He's the one who's supposed to be raiding the place. Ness is there as a private citizen, but he forces open the door and puts himself at great risk as far as he's aware of being shot. By that point, even though there's still some men inside, all of the gambling paraphernalia and everything have been cleaned out. So they're raiding an empty building. So as a law enforcement action, the raid on what's known as the Harvard Club is at best a mixed bag, at worst a failure. But the headlines the next day and the press coverage of Ness's courage and the integrity that he showed, backing up the county prosecutor in doing what he did to make a point about law has returned to Cuyahoga County, that is largely responsible for putting the corrupt elements of the city on notice, and in really signaling to the people of Cleveland that there's the proverbial new sheriff in town. So it's a major turning point in his career, and one of the, I think, most remarkable single acts of bravery that he ever performed in real life. Certainly much more remarkable than anything you've seen in the Hollywood versions, I'll tell you.
Right. And there was a possibility that the owners of the Harvard Club were stalling to buy time for Elvin Karpis, right?
That's right. Yes. I forgot to mention that Carpus, as I had said earlier, Cleveland was understood to be a safe city for lawbreakers like Alvin Carpus, that the Cleveland Syndicate were responsible for providing safe haven for those sorts of people in places like the Harvard Club. So yes, it came out after the fact. Ness didn't know this at the time, but Carpus, who at that point was the FBI's number one most wanted fugitive, the last of the public enemies, still at large, that he was happened to be in the Harvard Club when the raid came down. Because there were like I said, there were two clubs that were raided that night: the Thomas and the Harvard Club. The Thomas Club, they just sort of capitulated right away to Colletan. The Harvard Club, they put up this fight, and at the time it was not understood why they might be doing this. Later on, yes, it was alleged that Carpus was inside the club, and they were trying to buy time so he could escape, and that the evidence could be gotten rid of. So Ness, by the time Ness gets there, Carpus is long gone, certainly. So as a law enforcement action, as I said, it's not really effective. As a piece of symbolism, it is hugely important, even if Ness just missed his chance to be the one to collar Alvin Carpus.
Yeah. So while Ness is acclimating to his new position, something ominous is going on in the city. Body parts are turning up, mostly in a poor neighborhood called Kingsbury Run. From your understanding, what was Kingsbury Run like in the 1930s?
It was not all that different from what parts of it still look like even today. Kingsbury Run was this sort of riverbed valley, ancient river. It had been turned into a very industrial area by John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil decades before Ness came to town. So it was, even then, it was this post-industrial wasteland. It was, because it was a valley, it was very difficult to build. You could build houses on the edges of this valley, but deep within inside of it, it was overgrown. Trash. After the Depression, a lot of homeless, a lot of transients, people who were forced out of jobs and needed a place to live would sort of congregate in these areas, what were known as hobo jungles back then. And so it was like I said, even in the midst of an urban center, it was very remote, very you could stand at the bottom of this valley that was used only as the route for a railroad, a rapid transit system. But you could stand at the bottom of it at night and sort of feel cut off from the entire urban center around you. So very isolated, even in the middle of a highly developed area. And it had, because of the mass unemployment, because of the just economic devastation that had been brought about by the Depression, it became a very dangerous, a very neglected part of town. A lot of the crime, a lot of the vice that Ness was brought in specifically to deal with were centered in what was called the Roaring Third Police Precinct, which sort of encompassed and bordered on the Kingsbury Run area and spread out from the center of town, center of downtown, down into this, the industrial area around the Cuyahoga River called the Flats, and then into Kingsbury Run. So it was a very easy place, as it turned out, for someone to hide in, and for a large number of people to vanish without a trace into.
So much of your book is focused on this series of unsolved murders attributed to someone nicknamed the Mad Butcher, also known as the Cleveland Torso Murderer. When did the first murder connected to this killer take place? When and where? And what were the circumstances surrounding the murder?
The first murder, as far as we know, occurred in the latter part of 1934, as it happened right around the time that Ness himself was coming to Cleveland, not yet to work in city government, but still working with the alcohol tax unit, when the lower part of a woman's body washed ashore on the beach of Lake Erie, just outside the city of Cleveland. Other parts were seen. There were, reports of people seeing a hand waving or things like that. But at the time, because it wasn't a head, it wasn't anything that could be identified, and there were no even really indications that would easily suggest that someone had been murdered. The police couldn't be sure that they were dealing with a murder. They couldn't identify the body or the cause of death necessarily. They knew the body had been disarticulated, but it remained one of these mysterious, unsolved cases that happen in urban centers and might otherwise have been forgotten. Had it not been until the following year, within Kingsbury Run proper now, on a geographical formation known as Jackass Hill, where a couple of kids were running down the hill and came upon a couple of headless bodies with, as it turns out, the heads buried nearby and the genitals removed, signs possibly of torture on one of the bodies. Only one of a handful of these that were ever identified. But clearly by this point they could tell that this was a murder, specifically that decapitation was the cause of death, which is very unusual. It's not all that unusual for a murderer to cut up a body for disposal after the fact, but to remove a human head with all the mess that comes with that is very rare in the annals of homicide. The Cleveland police, who were investigating this murder, already knew that they had something strange on their hands. It became even clearer when they realized that this Jackass Hill, which has since been, it's part of it remains, the other part of it has been cut away for the highway. But even what remains that's there, you can tell it's very steep. And like I said, back then it was a very isolated, very remote at night part of town. And it became clear that whoever had murdered these people, or at least disposed of their bodies, had driven them to the top of this hill and then brought them down one at a time, apparently by himself, in darkness, and hadn't been seen. And as far as they knew, there were no witnesses. So he had the strength to do this, and he had the intention to stage, as you know, it's a term that would later come into use by serial killer profiles, but to stage this crime scene with the heads buried, but in a way that they might be found, to put his handiwork more or less on display. They didn't obviously know that this was the start of something. The police, falling back on their own prejudices, suggested this may be some dispute among one of the ethnic groups living in that part of the city. Like, they didn't really know what they were dealing with. But already the detective sort of had a bad feeling about what this was, because it was so unusual and it was so macabre that this was outside their experience for sure.
So more death, more murders followed. What were the common characteristics between them?
The common characteristic, the best criteria for linking these bodies together, is the fact that in almost all cases, at least where cause of death could be determined, that the cause of death was decapitation, that these people died from having their heads cut off. The next one that turns up in January of 1936, not long after the Harvard Club raid, so when Ness by this point is in charge of the Cleveland Police Department and beginning to establish himself as a figure in the city, somebody in another part of Cleveland a woman comes across these half bushel baskets near a butcher's shop with what looks like meat carefully wrapped up inside them. She tells the butcher. Eventually the butcher takes a look for himself and realizes that this is human flesh, that these are pieces of a woman's body. Again, someone who died from having her head cut off. More parts of her body would be found later, but not her head. However, thanks to having her arms and her hands, they could fingerprint her and find out that she was a prostitute by the name of Flo Polillo. So this adds to one of the bodies that had previously been discovered and that had been identified as a small-time ne'er-do-well and sometime employee in the mental ward of the local hospital by the name of Edward Andrassy. Those would be the only two bodies, victims of this sequence, who would ever be definitively identified. So the other distinguishing characteristic of this developing sequence of serial killings was that the vast majority of them would never be identified, which is not perhaps surprising back then, given the limits of forensic science and technology. It's only kind of a fluke that two of these early victims had police records so they could be tracked down through fingerprints. But if, as I said earlier, it's the Depression, you have a lot of transients, a lot of people riding the rails, coming through the city and passing through, who may have had lives in other parts of the country. It sort of became the accepted wisdom, although it's impossible to prove or disprove. But the common theory was that many of these people were transients, were victims of the Depression in some sense. So they may not have had roots in the city of Cleveland. They certainly didn't leave any evidence behind that would allow the vast majority of them to be identified. But it is nevertheless another remarkable and highly unusual characteristic of what became the Mad Butcher case, that so many of these victims remain unidentified to this day, that we don't know who they are. And it posed a significant challenge to the police investigators early on, who, even though, people were aware of Jack the Ripper, that was still seen as sort of a one-off. It was not commonly understood at that time that serial killers were a repeating phenomenon. So they didn't have a playbook. They didn't have an understanding of how you go about tracking and identifying someone like this. The common method for solving a murder was oftentimes to identify the victim and then to track known associates, because most murder victims are killed by someone they know, or at least in that time, killed as a result, perhaps of illegal activity. Ness in Chicago had become very familiar with gangland killings. People were killed for financial motives. Neither of those situations applied here. So, with police unable to identify, in most cases, known associates, unable to come up with a motive that anyone can understand, even to put a name and a face to most of these victims, it became exceedingly challenging for anybody to try and wrap their arms around how you would solve this case, as more and more decapitated, disarticulated, eventually just sort of fragments of bodies began turning up in Kingsbury Run, floating in the Cuyahoga River, in boxes on a garbage dump. As this started to escalate, nobody knew really how to proceed.
So Eliot Ness, as you have said, he was known for busting up stills, raiding breweries, gambling dens, attacking corruption, but he wasn't someone with much experience investigating unsolved murders, especially a series of horrific murders like this. He had a lot of duties as director of public safety. So how involved was he in the Mad Butcher case? What role did he play in the investigation?
I think that's what makes this case such a fascinating part of his story, because Ness comes into Cleveland with very clear ideas about law enforcement, about how to reform a police department, how to keep people safe, how to prevent crime. Like, he has a very scientific, very well thought out theory of criminology, of how to go about this job and how to perfect society. We talked last time about Ness being a successor to the progressive era social reformers. I mean, the Jane Addamses of the world. Having come out of that environment in Chicago, people who applied a very scientific understanding to social problems and believed, and this was part of what led to Prohibition, that you could scientifically perfect society through various kinds of reform. And that's what Ness is trying to do as the head of the police department in Cleveland. And the Mad Butcher case just explodes every part of his theory, that finds every weak point of it. And even though he had a lot of worthwhile ideas, it forces him to reckon with his shortcomings, and it catches him at his weakest points, because he, at least initially, is very challenged even to understand what's happening. So yes, there was. I mean, in Germany, in the 20s and 30s, this is when Ernst Gannat is developing the first understanding of Serienmörder, to use the German serial murder, based on the Peter Kürten case and everything like that. Those ideas had not really worked their way across the Atlantic just yet. So understanding this as a repeating pattern of behavior is not something Ness would have been familiar with. And there was a reluctance, certainly within the Cleveland Police Department, to treat these initially as anything more than isolated cases. But it's really after, I think it's in June 1936, when in Kingsbury Run, where there's a body, a decapitated body, but not otherwise mutilated, that turns up. He's known as the Tattooed Man because he's got these tattoos all over himself that one would think would make him easy to identify, but he would never be identified. And this happens right when it's 1936. It's a presidential election year. The Republican convention was being held that year in the city of Cleveland, and so all of these delegates from all over the country are showing up to nominate their candidate to take on Franklin Roosevelt. It's a moment when the city is supposed to be putting its best face forward to the country, like Cleveland is back. We're coming out of the Depression. We've got a new mayor and a new safety director. And the headlines are about the maniac who's going around chopping people's heads off. That's the moment when it becomes impossible to deny that one person is doing all of this. It's also a demonstration of how this is becoming a public relations problem for the city. And the program that Mayor Burton was trying to enact to help the city come out of the Depression, to not just clean up civic corruption, but to bring in business investment, is being threatened by the appearance of these horribly mutilated murder victims. And, as you said, Ness is very active in this period, going after police corruption, going after corrupt labor unions, trying to clean up the streets, literally in the sense of preventing traffic accidents and things like that. And almost like clockwork, whenever he's got a new initiative, whenever he's got some major indictments or a major case that he's building breaks, like right around that time, within a few weeks, or even in one case, like a day or two after, whenever Ness does something remarkable, another body turns up, and that's what ends up dominating the headlines. And so Ness, as the most visible element of Mayor Burton's plan to clean up the city, keeps getting dogged by this nameless, faceless murderer, who's not certainly at this stage planning this. Like, these people have been killed, and their bodies are discovered, days, weeks, months, perhaps after the murder. So it just happens this way. But Ness finds himself getting drawn into, having this monster playing counterpoint to everything that he's trying to do. Now, he's a police executive. He's the head of the police department, but he's not a homicide detective. He's not someone who is directly responsible for solving these crimes. And certainly, based on his experience and his training, that's not really something he's qualified to do. But by the fall of 1936, when several of these bodies now have turned up, and it's becoming a fixture in the news media, not just in Cleveland, but around the country, that's when the mayor sort of pushes Ness to at least publicly take some responsibility for the case, to meet with the police detective, the homicide detectives, Peter Merlo and Martin Zalewski, who had been directly put in charge of the homicide investigation, and to at least demonstrate that the Cleveland Police Department is taking this seriously. The county coroner at that time, a man by the name of Arthur Pierce, calls a meeting that became known as the Torso Clinic, where they brought together forensic scientists and officials from the police department, and Ness attends, and they sit around to go over the evidence of the bodies that have been discovered thus far, and to develop a profile of who they think might have been committing these murders. And, something similar had been done during the Jack the Ripper investigation. As far as we were able to determine, nobody had developed a serial killer profile since 1888. And now we're, almost 50 years later. Ness was doing that with Coroner Pierce and other members of the Cleveland Safety Department. And so they go over the evidence, and they theorize, and they suggest that, that this is someone who has an unspecified mental illness, but is probably able to conceal it for most of the time when he's not actively engaged in feeding his compulsion to kill. They suggest that it probably is a he, and that it's probably someone who has a certain amount of physical heft and strength just to be able to carry out these crimes. That it's someone who knows the Kingsbury Run area, who knows how to slip around undetected, and nevertheless has access to a facility which they described as a laboratory where he could conduct these murders. Because I know this is the most notorious podcast. I don't know how graphic we should get, but cutting off the head of a living person creates a mess, and people would notice. So there had to be some facility where he could do this without being seen, to clean and dispose of the remnants of his victims before he wrapped them up and threw them into the river. So, there was some suggestion that maybe he was doing it in a boxcar. Maybe, nobody knew, but he had to have some place where he could do this. So this is the standard practice now. It's something that the FBI, decades later, if you've seen the Netflix series Manhunter, you know that they've turned into a science. But it was really cutting edge in 36. But the interesting thing is that Ness, he's in attendance at this torso clinic. And as far as we know, he really only asks one question, or makes sort of a comment as this is being discussed, which is to suggest that whatever the killer's motive is, that he's cutting these heads off to prevent identification of the victims, that he's trying to conceal the identities of whoever he's murdering. And I think it's really telling because, as we've said, Ness was used to dealing with gangsters and corrupt officials and rational lawbreakers. And so he's trying to wrap his mind around a crime that is fundamentally irrational, or at least committed by someone who doesn't think like Ness does, whose motives for this make sense to the killer but might not make sense to anyone else. And so Ness is trying to find a practical reason. He's trying to make this make sense in a way that it fundamentally doesn't. So he's, as someone who, would talk about that the way to bring down crime is to bring down all sorts of crime, like anticipating what became known as the broken windows theory, that Ness would argue that in a town where there's a lot of gangsters, a lot of lawbreakers, crimes of all sorts, even these serial murders or sexual assaults or things like that, he would argue that criminals are all of the same kind, and if you give them license, they're going to feel free to do what they're going to want to do. But if you crack down, if you go after corruption, if you cut down on labor racketeering and even traffic accidents, that's going to bring down the temperature, and you won't have these sorts of strange serial murders. And of course, we know now that that's not how this works. But that's, at least in the early period of this multiple year investigation, that's how he was trying to think about it. He was trying to project some sense of rationality onto a series of crimes that were fundamentally irrational.
Yeah. So one of the suspects, probably the primary suspect at this point, was known as Dr. X, ultimately revealed to be Francis Sweeney. Could you talk about this man's background and why he is suspected of being the Mad Butcher?
Dr. X, as he was discussed or referred to by some of the investigators who were aware of this aspect of the investigation, was a physician who had fallen on hard times as a result of an apparent mental breakdown. in the 1930s. I mean, he was from the Kingsbury Run area, so he fit that element of the profile that he knew the area. He'd grown up there, knew it intimately. He'd gone to medical school. He had served in World War One, so he had had a very distinguished and outwardly successful career before he started drinking heavily. He started exhibiting signs of some sort of psychosis. Obviously, it's not possible to diagnose him based on the limited amount of information that exists. But right around the time the first bodies that we know of started turning up in 1934, Sweeney's life, his marriage had fallen apart. He had been living in a medical practice that he shared with some other doctors, and a building that, as it turned out, matched the location and description of a story that was told by someone who believed that he had narrowly escaped being one of the butcher's victims, having found his way to this medical office and having been apparently given a drugged meal and then waking up and escaping, as we talk about in the book. But it was there was a sense, one of the theories that the coroner and the investigators came up with early on, as they were examining what little physical evidence that they had of these murders, that whoever cut the bodies apart had some knowledge of anatomy, whether it was a literal butcher or a hunter or a medical man, someone who knew how to take a body apart efficiently. So there had been a search for potential medical suspects. Any doctor who seemed a little off in Cleveland at that time would at least be questioned or investigated. And the investigators that Ness was working with, because as we talked about last time, Ness in Chicago had developed this penchant for secrecy, this tendency to, he trusted himself and he trusted his own good intentions, and he used the press, but he was very careful about what he said publicly and about what he let get out about his investigations. So as there's this very public hunt for the Mad Butcher, and as the police detectives Merlot and Zalewski were sort of publicly following up a lot of these leads that turned out to be dead ends, Ness, even though it seemed like he was not taking an active interest in the case, was working with a man by the name of David Cowles, who was the chief sort of forensic scientist for the police department, and some hand-picked detectives who were carrying on this investigation largely in secret. And they came to Frank Sweeney as someone who fit the profile in those respects. The medical practice that he had been associated with brought him into contact with a doctor who had the responsibility for dealing with indigent corpses that turned up that had to be buried by the city. And so there was essentially an industrial funeral parlor that Sweeney would have had access to. And there were reports that he, quote unquote, practiced surgery on some of these bodies, that he would cut them up in ways that very closely resembled the way the butcher's victims were dismembered before they were disposed of. So he was working out some inner compulsion there that appeared to match what the butcher was doing. But the great challenge that Ness and his investigators faced, not only, did they not have an understanding of what a serial killer really was, but forensic science, as we know about it today, was very much in its infancy. They didn't have DNA. I mean, they barely had fingerprinting in various kinds of trace evidence, but they were dealing in many cases with naked body parts. As I said, not even heads, not even hands or arms in many cases. So they couldn't identify the bodies. They couldn't look for the sort of trace evidence that today you could match to a suspect for a DNA match. They didn't have anything like that. So they had somebody who seemed very unusual, who certainly behaved in suspicious ways and exhibited behavior that matched their profile and matched what they saw in the evidence, but they had no way of connecting him directly to any of the bodies that were turning up. All they could do was follow him around, and hope to catch him in the act. But they had a serious complication, because back then, this was, as we said, a more, as we were talking about earlier, an era in which law enforcement was a lot cruder and more brutal than we would accept now today. The Cleveland Police Department, in particular, before Ness got there, was notorious for, third degree interrogations of essentially beating confessions out of suspects or torturing them until they would confess to murders. Ness tried to put a stop to that, and succeeded in large measure during his time as safety director. But even that would not have been an option when they were dealing with Francis Sweeney, because Sweeney's he had a cousin, I believe. It was not an immediate family relation, but a close enough family relation to a very powerful congressman in the Cleveland area, a man by the name of Martin Sweeney, who was a Democrat, so who was of the opposite political party as Ness's administration. And not only that, just happened to be one of Mayor Burton and Eliot Ness's most vocal critics in the Cleveland area, specifically on the issue of the Torso murders, particularly in the run up to the 1937 elections. Congressman Sweeney was attacking Burton and Ness for their inability to catch this killer, saying things like, Ness is running around prosecuting policemen who took $25 10 years ago, while this monster is going around, this modern Dracula, I think he used that phrase, it's going around chopping people's heads off. And this is the new police department that the Burton administration has brought to the city of Cleveland. And Congressman Sweeney is saying all of this while, trying to bring in his own political allies to replace Burton and Ness in the city administration. So Ness is not a political animal, is not somebody who had the desire or the aptitude to operate politically, but he was smart enough to know that if any indications of this investigation got out at all, and they didn't have direct hard evidence that would tie Frank Sweeney to these crimes, that the perception would be that Ness and Burton were attacking their political adversary by going after his family. And, with a flimsy circumstantial case, trying to pin these unsolved murders on the Sweeney family. So Ness is forced to walk a very fine line, to follow this guy, to shadow him, to have him, monitored as best they can. Sweeney had a tendency to check himself into a veterans hospital in a nearby town. He just happened to be there right around the time a lot of these murders were supposed to be committed and when the bodies turned up. So he was apparently establishing an alibi for himself. But until they had some direct, hard evidence, even though, the bodies kept piling up, and even though Ness increasingly came to believe that he knew who did it, there was very little he could do publicly to address the mounting fear.
I had a guest a few years ago who is pretty convinced that Sweeney was the Mad Butcher. And I know this is speculation, so you don't have to go here, of course, if you don't want to. But what do you think the likelihood is that Sweeney committed some or all of these murders?
I think you're referring to Jim Badal, who wrote has written a trilogy of books on the Cleveland Torso murders. Someone who we talked to when we were working on the book, and is really the expert on the murders specifically on this case. So he did a lot of the initial digging into Sweeney, along with some other researchers in Cleveland, because Ness had given a version of this story later in life that, like some of the Chicago exploits that we were talking about last time, had been discredited or doubted. People assumed that he was telling a story to put a happy ending on an unsolved case, and Jim and some other researchers in Cleveland were the first people who really identified that this suspect that was referred to as a pseudonym in the story that initially came from Ness was actually tied to this specific individual, Francis Sweeney. Certainly, Ness believed that he had found the man who did it. There's an incident that we describe in the book where Ness really is a sign of desperation now. This is in the middle of 1938, where he has his detectives detain Sweeney, take him to a hotel suite where Ness often would bring witnesses for questioning in these investigations, whether into the mob or into police corruption that he was building. So they bring Sweeney to this hotel suite. They have to wait until he's sobered up because he was drinking very heavily by that point. And then Ness brings in a couple people that he knew from his Chicago days, who were the inventors of the modern lie detector. And it's a very interesting and a very telling moment because they're two guys who had worked with August Vollmer in developing the lie detector, Leonard Keeler and John Larson. And they are sort of the ultimate odd couple in the sense that their relationship by that point had entirely been fractured. Keeler was a promoter. He was very good at monetizing the polygraph technology. He's largely responsible for the image of it and its accuracy that we have today, which largely overstates the case, I think, in some ways. But he really popularized the idea of the polygraph and himself as its practitioner. Larson was an academic. He was much more careful. He was much more circumspect. He didn't see it as a tool for peering into guilty hearts so much as he saw it as something that could be used by investigators in questioning to draw out areas that may otherwise remain hidden, but that could lead them to harder evidence. So their approaches to the technology, their ways of using it to question suspects were entirely different. And Ness, very astutely, had both of them come in separately to question Sweeney, to run him on the machine, to see if they could perhaps get him to crack, get him to admit to something, or to see what came out of the questioning. Keeler left entirely convinced that this was the Mad Butcher, told Ness, I might as well throw my machine out the window if this isn't your man. Larson, the more skeptical, nevertheless, as he was questioning Sweeney, began to see what he described as in the readout of the machine as evidence indicative of guilt. And as the questioning got more pointed, Sweeney called it to a halt and demanded to speak to a lawyer and sort of brought that aspect of the interrogation to a halt. So while Larson would never, I think, say definitively that they'd found the man, I think he was of the opinion that it was more likely than not that this was the killer. And after that, as far as we know from the version of the tale that apparently came from Ness, filtered through the associate of his who told it later, Ness took a moment alone with Sweeney and said, "I think you killed those people." And Sweeney said, "You think I did it? Prove it." And Ness couldn't. And so that was the end of that. They had to let him go. But after that point, Sweeney began to fix his paranoid delusions on Ness and to send him mocking postcards and to call him at odd hours of the day, apparently to say things that seemed only the killer could have known, making Ness more and more convinced that this was the man. The interrogation happens around the spring of 1938. Two more bodies would turn up later that summer in a garbage dump near the site of what is now the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland, but within sight of Ness's window in City Hall. And one of the bodies was quite old, I think a year or more old. The other one, there were indications that it was a body that had already been embalmed, so that it was perhaps not a murder victim, but somebody who, a corpse that had been cut up after it had been prepared for a funeral, possibly as a prank. That was one of the theories that the police were working under at that time. Certainly seemed like to those who knew about the interrogation that had already taken place that Sweeney may have been leaving a message for Eliot Ness, but even then it didn't prove that he was, even if he had done that, it didn't prove that he was the murderer of the other victims or necessarily a murderer here. just was guilty of grave robbery, but perhaps not homicide. But after that, with a handful of possible exceptions in later years, the sequence of killings stop. And it's also a moment after that 1938 investigation, Ness greatly increases the surveillance of Frank Sweeney. Sweeney would play games with the police. He would, lead them on chases and then try to lose them and then call them later and say, if you want me, I'll be at such and such a place at such and such a time. He spends more and more time at the Veterans Hospital that he'd been checking himself into, and the Veterans Hospital would alert the Cleveland police whenever he left. So after that point, after Sweeney, it becomes much harder for him to track down victims and murder them in secret. The murders apparently stop. And that, to my mind, has always been the most, one of the most compelling indications that Ness had found his man, because even though he couldn't publicly accuse him, even though he couldn't convict him or put him away, Ness, with admittedly extra legal methods, denied Sweeney, if he was the butcher, the opportunity to commit more crimes. And once that happened, there seemed to have been no more murders in Kingsbury Run committed by the Mad Butcher. So I'm not going to answer your question definitively, but that's the one thing that leaves me certainly understanding where Ness was coming from when he believed with an absolute certainty near the end of his life that he had found the man, but that he couldn't prove it.
Yeah. How many murders are believed to be the work of the Mad Butcher?
Estimates vary, 12 or 13 or 14, depending on how you count. 2 of them were definitively identified. Some people don't count the first one that turned up in 1934, which became known as the Lady of the Lake. There were later murders. I mean, Detective Merlot, who seems to have become obsessed with the case, eventually became convinced that the butcher was killing in other parts of the region, in other cities in Ohio, and Jim Badal has written on this extensively, and I agree that Merlot was barking up the wrong tree there. That this specific sequence of murders of people, primarily if not exclusively killed by decapitation, in the mid 1930s in Cleveland, were the work of a single perpetrator who stopped operating after 1938, with one possible exception that's talked about in the book. But so 12 or 13, again, depending on how you count. There's always the chance, one of the victims that was tentatively identified. So two were positively identified. A third, a woman by the name of Rose Wallace, was believed to be one of the victims who was found as a skeleton under the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge in Cleveland, which incidentally is decorated with the sculptures, the Guardians of Traffic, who have given their name now to Cleveland's baseball team. But that murder is often attributed to the butcher. I think it's probably true that body was Rose Wallace, that skeleton, but the circumstances of her death, and for various reasons that we get into in the book, that's one where I'm less convinced that that's part of the butcher sequence. So that's a very long answer to say that, there's 12 or 13 that I would feel confident pinning on a single perpetrator, and a few more that start to get a little fuzzier.
There was another suspect, right, that wasn't really on Ness's radar, but he was arrested anyway in 1939. His name was Frank Dolezal. Would you talk briefly about him, who he was, and why he was suspected of the murders?
Yes, and this is not part of Eliot Ness's secret investigation. Certainly by 1939, when the murders, as far as we know, had stopped, Ness was totally convinced that he'd found the man, but he couldn't say it publicly. Nevertheless, he ends up being indirectly the cause for what happened with Frank Dolezal, because as I alluded to, there's this political battle going on in the city of Cleveland, and the county of Cuyahoga between the Republican administration of Mayor Burton and Eliot Ness and the Democratic political machine of which Congressman Martin Sweeney and the sheriff at that time, O'Donnell, were both a major part of. And the sheriff had been working with a private detective who had developed his own theory of the Mad Butcher case, who had come to believe that this unemployed at that time, I think, bricklayer by the name of Frank Dolezal was the murderer, because he appeared to have known the victims who had been identified. He sort of frequented the same parts of town that they did. There was one, I think, bar that they all, the victims who had, even Rose Wallace, had at least spent time around in the Roaring Third, and Frank Dolezal had as well. So this private detective, trying to follow the typical, playbook for investigating a murder at that time, trying to find known associates and to link these victims as best he could, eventually settled on this particular part of town and this particular suspect who was in emotional distress. He tended to drink. He was apparently gay, and at a time when that was illegal in the city of Cleveland. A lot of suspects in the Butcher investigation would be, picked up and charged by the police department for sodomy, as the crime was defined at that time. So that already made Dolezal a marginalized figure, someone who struggled with his own sexuality and trying to just, I think, find companionship. So he drank to deal with his depression. He could get violent when he was drinking, sort of belligerent, but otherwise he seems to have been a rather harmless figure, but someone who, because of who he was and his position in the city, was marginalized, and who was vulnerable to being taken advantage of, let's say, by the authorities. And so the private detective and the sheriff thought that they may have had somebody who at least was worth talking to as a suspect in their minds. But the sheriff and Congressman Sweeney in 1939 were becoming increasingly concerned that Eliot Ness might run for mayor. He had been talked about as someone who would succeed Burton as a Republican. As you said earlier, he was very careful to be apolitical, to not vote, to not declare a political allegiance one way or the other. Nevertheless, this was a rumor that was going around, and so, or that he might run for sheriff at that point. I think it was he might run for sheriff. He was talked about as a potential mayoral candidate when Burton retired. In 39, the question was whether he might challenge O'Donnell as sheriff. And so O'Donnell decided that the way he was going to defend his position and really put one over on Eliot Ness was that he was going to solve the Torso murders. And so the sheriff's department arrested Frank Dolezal, and then did what, as I alluded to earlier, was the common practice at that time, was when they didn't have hard evidence, to try and beat a confession out of him, which they did successfully. He confessed to the murder of Flo Polillo, one of the initial ones, someone he had known, and described it in ways that it had, essentially been an accident, and that he had then cut up the body to dispose of it, which of course doesn't match the idea of this being a serial murder case at all. But nevertheless, that's what he said under extreme duress. So then O'Donnell, very publicly says, "I have solved the Torso murders, and here he is," and gets a lot of headlines for it. There's a lot of press commentary that he's specifically talking about this as a political victory for the Democratic sheriff over the Republican safety director. So it was understood as a political thing at that time. However, the police detective Merlo, who had dedicated his life to this case, knew right away that there were inconsistencies in the confession that Dolezal had provided. So conveniently enough, another confession comes out with different inconsistencies. So finally, there's a third confession that seems to match the facts as they were understood. But by that point, Dolezal had managed to get some word out to the press that would indicate that he had been mistreated. He had visible, bruises and other indications that he had been beaten. Yeah, it was becoming increasingly clear that this was not on the up and up. And the press now that had previously been sort of praising O'Donnell at Ness's expense were now suggesting that there was some serious miscarriage of justice going on here. Nevertheless, the sheriff proceeded toward an arraignment and an appearance before the grand jury. Shortly before that happened, Frank Dolezal apparently hanged himself in his jail cell. I believe he was something like 5'6", and he hanged himself from a hook that was 5 foot 5 inches off the ground, something like that. So there were, once the autopsy information came out, again, Badal has written on this extensively, but it's almost all but certain that this was not a suicide, that Dolezal was murdered, and that likely he was killed by people in the sheriff's office to prevent the full story of his torture at the hands of the sheriff's department from coming out. By that point, it had been a year or more since there had been a torso murder victim. Very few people, I think, were convinced that Dolezal had been the torso murderer. So O'Donnell didn't get credit for solving the case. But as the murders had apparently stopped, it became easier to sort of put this in the rearview mirror and to forget about it for large segments of the population. So this, in a sense, marked the end of the public investigation, even though nobody today certainly seriously believes that Dolezal was the torso murderer. But it's one of the great silences in Eliot Ness's life. Certainly, he never would have commented on this publicly, but you can imagine the frustration he would have felt, believing that he knew who the murderer was, believing that he had at least taken steps to prevent that person from killing again, to then be publicly dragged into this controversy that ultimately ended up costing an innocent man his life, and not being able to tell the world what he knew, because Ness couldn't. Certainly, after the Frank Dolezal affair happened, Ness had even more reasons not to publicly accuse Frank Sweeney, because his suspect's congressman cousin was directly involved in the directly involved politically with the sheriff who had accused this guy in order to get political advantage over Eliot Ness. So the political dimension of what happened here made it not only enabled this horrible injustice to happen to Frank Dolezal, but made it even less likely that justice could be done with the suspect that Ness believed to have been the Mad Butcher. So in every respect, this became a horrible miscarriage of justice that Ness was unable to do anything about publicly.
It was interesting for me over the course of reading both of your books to see how Ness changed over time. He started as this serious, teetotaling, straight-laced do-gooder, and by the end of the second book, he's become really obsessed with social climbing. Lots of parties. He's drinking way more than he ever has. He definitely changes. Cleveland changes him, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's again, this is when we get back to the simplistic narratives that we wrote these books in large part to counteract. But there had been sort of a prevailing myth around him that he, or a delight perhaps in the irony of the most famous Prohibition agent ever dying a probable alcoholic, and that perhaps his drinking was what was responsible for wrecking his life during the Cleveland years. As you said, he's certainly not a drinker before he becomes a Prohibition agent. We talk in Scarface and the Untouchable about how alcoholism was weirdly an occupational hazard of being a prohibition agent, because that was a large part of how they would investigate liquor cases, that they would go undercover and they would, what was called making buys, but they would buy alcohol. I mean, I was fortunate enough to flip through the personal diary or day book of one of the Untouchables. That it was the book was loaned to me by his son, Barney Cloonan's day book. But the whole thing was noting down the expenses that he paid at speakeasies, and it would be ridiculous amounts. Like 3 drinks of hard liquor and 5 glasses of beer, 75 cents each, and so they're putting away large amounts of alcohol in the line of duty. On the when you look at their personnel files, they could be written up for drinking not on duty. Drinking on duty was often totally fine. Drinking off duty was not allowed. So Ness, in his work as an undercover prohibition agent, seems to have been his, if not his introduction to alcohol, certainly when he developed a taste for it. But our impression from researching the book is that, as you said, it's not the alcohol specifically that ends up becoming his addiction in the Cleveland years. It's really the social life and the status that he enjoys in the city of Cleveland. Ness was a civil servant. He was never making a huge amount of money, although certainly he was well paid in the Depression years by comparison with a lot of people. But because of his public profile, because of his association with the mayor, and because he was at least affiliated with a political party, the Republican Party, that certainly at that time was the party of business and the party of wealth and the elite, Ness finds himself living a lifestyle that is beyond what he could have enjoyed on his own. He's living beyond his means, certainly, not just financially, but socially as well. So he ends up living with his second wife in a boathouse that is owned by one of the rich families in the city of Cleveland, that is in a very exclusive, very wealthy part of the community, surrounded by actual rich people. And he starts to behave like a rich person, start buying new cars on a whim, things like that. He develops a great affinity for boats, and commuting even by boat on Lake Erie. So he starts taking on the hobbies and going to parties and things, spending a lot of time at nightclubs with successful people. I mean, he certainly subscribed to the American definition of success as wealth and social status, and I think he wanted to achieve that. And he perhaps, on some level, came to believe that this career that he'd helped invent of being a professional law enforcement officer allowed him to short circuit that. He wasn't a businessman at all. He didn't have a head for that, or politics, but he had found a way to establish himself socially. And so once we get into the 1940s, and once America enters World War II and he becomes involved with the war effort in the form of the Social Protection Bureau, Social Protection Division, Ness becomes what they were called dollar-a-year men, which was rich people who didn't need extra income would take a government job, in charge of defense production or whatever, and they would accept a $1 a year salary because they didn't need the money. They were doing it just because it was their patriotic duty. Ness was never a wealthy person, but he initially takes $1 a year salary to lead the Social Protection Division while he's still employed in Cleveland. So he's spending more time involved in his work in Washington than he is in Cleveland, perhaps, for the final year or so of his tenure as safety director. But I think it signals how he was thinking of himself. He was putting himself like Capone, frankly, who came to believe that he was part of an elite social class that never wanted anything to do with him. Ness came to believe that he was a member of the social elite that enjoyed having him around, that enjoyed socializing with him when he was safety director, because he was exciting and famous and doing all sorts of daring things. And there are many stories of his social acquaintances who would be out with him at parties, and he would get a call and he would just take whoever was with him along for the ride. And, so people would come away with this exciting, they didn't know what was going on, but they always remembered, speeding along with him with the siren blaring, going 100 miles an hour to the scene of some crime. So he was a very exciting person to know, and someone who everybody was inviting to parties. Alcohol was a part of that. And then once he's no longer safety director, once he's no longer even the head of the social protection division, once all of that is taken away, and he tried to make his way in legitimate business, he could never find his footing again. And so that's really, I think, when his drinking becomes worse, when he's drinking at home, and not as much socially, but he's experiencing the withdrawal symptoms of the lifestyle that he'd gotten used to being taken away from him. So the tragedy of Eliot Ness, I would argue, is not that he became an alcoholic necessarily when he was safety director of Cleveland, but that he got addicted to a lifestyle that he never really should have been a part of. And that's gradually what pulled him off course. That's when he lost his way, when he stopped thinking of himself as a lawman and started thinking of himself more as, to quote one of my favorite radio shows, a wealthy young man about town, when he never was that in real life.
So living beyond his means on a government salary, either he was going into debt or he was being supported by people. What do you theorize is the reason he was able to live such a luxurious lifestyle?
A little bit of both. I think a lot of the benefits that he enjoyed were perks, like the boathouse. You see in some of the cases that he took on, some of the causes that were his priorities. When he was safety director, he was going after labor racketeering, for example, certainly traffic safety. A lot of things that were problems, particularly to the business community, the social and political elite, were his priorities. So he got to know the family, for example, that gave him the boathouse, because he was responsible for prosecuting the racketeers who had been extorting them. And so, in that sense, once he enters that social world, doors sort of open up. So I can't speculate to the extent that, he's buying the cars on his own salary, but what terms is he getting? Are people giving him a cut rate price or things like that? It is an irony of his life that he was the untouchable, in the sense that he would never take a bribe, that he famously refused vast sums of money from the Capone organization, and was absolutely pitiless when it came to gangsters and corrupt officials. But as we quote one of his friends in the book, who talked about Ness's tendency to put people in separate baskets, where if you were a gangster, if you were a crook that he could readily identify as a lawbreaker, you could get nothing past him. But if you ended up in the other basket, if he thought you were an upstanding person or someone he could trust, you could almost literally get away with murder. It's happened, in multiple instances with people who Ness came into association with, who ended up abusing his trust terribly. So in that sense, I think he did not understand how easily he could be co-opted by the socio-political elite of the city of Cleveland. He certainly he would talk to police officers about, never accept favors. If somebody offers to give you a free cup of coffee because you're in uniform, you have to refuse, because they're not giving you a free cup of coffee, they're buying your badge. So yeah, Ness would certainly pay for things for himself, would in his own mind believe that everything was on the up and up. Nevertheless, he was clearly the beneficiary of perks and of social status and of favorable treatment that ended up prejudicing his judgment, and I think leading him down a path that ended very poorly for him.
Yeah. One more thing I'd like to ask you about. We all know about the Untouchables in Chicago, But Ness had a second group in Cleveland nicknamed the Unknowns.
Hmm.
Was that just a play on the Untouchables because the press wanted to give him a similar group of mysterious and trustworthy companions, officers, that sort of lit the public's imagination in his fight against crime?
Yeah, I think it was characterized that way, perhaps by the press. I don't know. We talked last time about where the Untouchables name came from, about how that was sort of used jokingly within the Justice Department before it came out into the public consciousness. I don't know if Ness ever referred to his own team as the Unknowns, but it reflects again his passion for secrecy and his tendency to do things in the shadows and put a case together and then sort of spring it on the press and count on favorable press coverage, but to be very secretive beforehand. So the Unknowns quote unquote team came about when he was doing these initial investigations of police, corrupt police officers in Cleveland and labor officials, when he didn't feel that he could trust members of the police department, and so he put together teams of people like himself, people he'd known, whether at the alcohol tax unit or in other capacities, somewhat on the Untouchables model, bringing in outsiders and keeping them separate from the established law enforcement as a way to give them the sense that they were more trustworthy. It also, I think, it may bear a closer relationship to the Secret Six, who we also talked about last time. It was a very similar playbook to that organization in Chicago that had been established by the business community, where they hired their own investigators, where it was financed by elite businessmen who were concerned about racketeering and the damage that Capone's notoriety was doing to the reputation of the city of Chicago. So they put in their own money, they hired their own people, and then they collaborated with the federal investigators to bring Capone down. But it was an extra legal effort. Ness did something similar in the city of Cleveland, where he went to the business community, where he got their support, even for the torso investigation. Some of what he was doing, sort of off the books, was with the assistance of wealthy members of the Cleveland community, but especially when it came to his labor racketeering investigations, traffic safety. Ness would put his unknown investigators on the payroll as laborers or clerks or something like that, to disguise what they were doing. But a lot of their work was aided or financed by public spirited citizens, let's say. So that was a strategy that had worked, perhaps was a mixed success in Chicago, but Ness had seen how it could be effective, and he tried to use it in a similar fashion. Again, it was another demonstration of how he seemed blind to the fact that powerful interest groups who offer various kinds of support often want something in return. They want law enforcement to do what they want it to do. And so that, I think, was part of the process that pulled Ness off his path, because at a certain point is he a servant of the people, or is he a servant of Mayor Burton's wealthy supporters? So yes, Ness had a team of investigators who were key to building some of his cases, but it became certainly later on in his safety directorship, when he was getting attacked politically, both in the press and by political opponents of the mayor. They would often use this against him as an example of his own secret police. And I think Ness, as someone who had all the best intentions in the world, and I think believed in his own integrity and his own rightness, could oftentimes make poor judgment calls, just mistakes, not being nefarious, but believing that people should just trust him, and they did for the first few years of his safety directorship. But after the Butcher investigation, his inability to publicly solve that case, and some of the actions that he took as a result of that, began to turn the press against him, began to turn some of the public opinion against him, and he lost a lot of the goodwill that he'd built up, sort of was frittered away over time, and the freedom he had enjoyed to operate under the radar was gradually reduced.
Well, gosh, I appreciate you spending so much time with us. Are you working on anything new right now? Maybe true crime related?
Not true crime related. I am certainly on a new book project, more in the space of my first book, which dealt with Orson Welles and the War of the Worlds. This is going back to the early days of broadcast journalism, and trying to uncover the threads of how we've gotten to this point, and perhaps how we might be able to fix it going forward. So that's what I'm working on right now. I would say, though, that if people read the books or listen to this podcast and are interested in Eliot Ness and want to know more, there is a museum that has been established in a small town in Pennsylvania called Coudersport, where Eliot Ness, as you'll discover if you read Eliot Ness and the Mad Butcher, where he ended up at the end of his life, and sort of where the legacy of the Untouchables was born. A museum has been established in this small town in western Pennsylvania. They have a festival that was supposed to be held every year. It's been canceled the past couple of years because of COVID, of course, but my understanding is that it's moving ahead this year. I know some things that I am sworn to secrecy on as far as the planning of that festival, but it was a great event. 2 years before the pandemic, it sounds like it's coming back even bigger than before. So if anybody wants to know more about Eliot Ness and the legend of the Untouchables, the Eliot Ness Fest and the Eliot Ness Museum in Coudersport, Pennsylvania, are something to explore. And I hope the festival will be held, and will be able to be held safely later this summer in July.
Oh, that sounds like fun.
Yeah, they have costumed reenactors and talks. I've spoken there before. I'm scheduled to speak there again. They have all these antique cars. The Cleveland Police Historical Society, which maintains Ness's legacy in Cleveland, often has a presence there with some of the police vehicles from his era. All sorts of fun stuff, film screenings, and it's remarkable. Like, I've had this experience a couple times now, when I was involved in a PBS documentary about the War of the Worlds broadcast, and now with the Eliot Ness Festival. Like, it's similar to being a fiction writer. I didn't create these characters, but it is very bizarre to go to a town that is dressed up for the Roaring '20s, and to see people portraying the characters that you've gotten to know when you're writing it. It's just like it's like they've jumped out of your head. It's really weird, but in a good way, and very fun. So, like I said, hopefully that's able to move forward, and if people in the area want to know more, I would Google Eliot Ness Fest. Follow them on Facebook. I think they have a Facebook page if you want the latest.
Well, this has been so great, Brad. Thank you again.
No problem. Thank you.
Again, my guest has been A. Brad Schwartz. He, along with co-author Max Allan Collins, wrote Eliot Ness and the Mad Butcher, hunting America's deadliest unidentified serial killer at the dawn of modern criminology. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.